Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of our China under Trump series. Today we will be discussing the relations between China and the US in the African continent. And joining me today to discuss this is John Ashbourne, Africa economist at Capital Economics. Thank you so much for joining us,
Thanks
John.
for having me.
So first off, I wanted to ask you about US policy towards the African continent. It seems to be that Africa is not necessarily on one of the top priorities for the Trump administration. In fact, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross only in August said something officially about this, and he essentially just signaled that the status quo was going to be maintained. I mean, how should we expect US relations to be going forward under this presidency?
To be honest, Africa is seldom a big focus of American foreign policy. So in some ways, the Obama administration was a bit of an aberration in that there was more effort put on Africa than usually you see. And the Trump administration, we should be honest, has been a bit vague on its foreign policy views on most of the world. So it isn't really surprising that Africa hasn't been their top priority. But we are getting a sense that this won't be something that they're following up on very closely. Foreign policy under this administration has been focused very much on North Korea, on China, and on, to a lesser extent, Iran. And we have very little detail of what it means. I don't get the sense this is really on the top of the radar screen of anyone in Washington.
And in terms of the staffings also to cover this continent, it seems that those places have not been filled yet.
No, there's a lot of empty seats in the Africa desks at the State Department and other organs of the US government. I think that's also true in other parts of the world, but there doesn't seem to be a rush to fill those in. Now, as long as those aren't filled, that means that continuity reigns, and you'll have civil servants keeping things ticking over, and so nothing much will change. And we won't really know who has those roles permanently for some time, and only then will we get a clearer sense of where things will be moving for the next few years.
And some initiatives also that the Obama administration has kicked off, we're not sure whether those will be continued either, are we?
We aren't. So there was one of the biggest policies for Barack Obama in Africa was called Power Africa, which is a plan designed to bring more electricity generation to the continent, funded by the American government, but also involving a lot of American companies. It isn't clear what the future of that program is. We haven't seen as much push towards conferences between the US and African policymakers in the way we did in the last administration. So again, this may be a slow start, but it's now been quite a while to have no real direction given.
Exactly. In terms of China, I wanted to ask you a little bit about their positioning, because obviously in recent years they've really ramped up, especially commercial ties with the African continent. Trade has increased something like 20-fold in 14 years. I think China is now lending 1/6 of total lending to Africa. So obviously efforts have been humongous. I mean, considering this kind of background and what we've just discussed about the US, how should we see the US and Chinese relationship going forward in Africa? Should we be anticipating a potential US void that China would want to fill?
Well, you're right that there's been a huge amount of active policy making on the Chinese side. So there's now a biennial conference between China and sub-Saharan African leaders that meets on political issues and on economic issues. There's been a big push for Chinese companies in the sort of going out policy of the 80s and 90s and 2000s to really focus on Africa. And that's certainly happened in a really big way, and China is now the biggest single trade partner with sub-Saharan Africa. It's the biggest source of FDI into the continent. So there's been a huge success. Now, whether or not this is a significant problem for the US is a different question, because obviously this is a huge continent. There's room for a lot of FDI to go in. It isn't necessarily a zero-sum game. But you do get the sense that the Chinese government has been much more active, much more focused on Africa. And also it's the case that you have a significant complementarity between the Chinese economy and a lot of African ones. So in China, you have a country which is hugely hungry for foreign natural resources, and which also produces the sort of low-cost goods which are in huge demand in developing countries. So America doesn't necessarily have as much of a natural affinity in terms of what it produces and consumes with a country like Nigeria or Cameroon as somewhere like China does.
Perfect. And lastly, I wanted to ask you about security. So in terms of the US policy historically in Africa, there definitely has been a strong security angle to it, and also a nation-building angle to it. But can we really expect this to continue under such a transactional administration like Trump's?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, it's certainly right that security has been a big focus of American policymaking, and to some extent, a lot of what the American government does in terms of security in Africa is now anti-terrorism spending, and that does seem to be one of the few consistent policies of the Trump administration. So insofar as this policy is supporting fighting against Islamic extremists in Somalia and in Nigeria, you can understand that perhaps being more in tune with the current administration's policies. It's true that China has become more engaged. We have the military base in Djibouti, obviously, that gets a lot of coverage. But to be honest, it's a relatively small establishment. There's only one of them, and it's mostly focused on anti-piracy efforts in the Indian Ocean. It happens to be in Africa, but the focus is offshore. Whereas in the United States case, there are American soldiers in something like 20 countries doing training exercises on a much grander scale than it's really easy to imagine the Chinese taking that role.
And it seems like the Chinese security efforts seem to be sort of more reactive. If there's a problem that also affects Chinese business directly, they seem to be engaging in security help. Otherwise, it doesn't really seem to be anything else.
There's much less appetite for outgoing security operations by the Chinese still. I mean, there was some Chinese peacekeepers who were killed in South Sudan, and that was a huge issue domestically. I mean, that having Chinese soldiers die in a conflict far away that the public didn't understand was a big shock and a big change from Chinese foreign policy. So I think there's very little appetite to have a Chinese drone base in Niger. That level of thing is decades away.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your insight, John.
Thank you for having me.